So what I'm going to present you in this seminar is the result of about 25 years of study embedded in the island of Delos and its archaeological material, thanks to the work of the French school at Athens, who had been excavating, as you know, the island since 1873. I was given the opportunity to study both the inscriptions, the coins, and the archaeological remains, and I really benefited from 150 years of accumulated knowledge to which many scholars who have studied series of archaeological material have contributed. Delos is a word in itself, a kind of Pompeii of the Aegean, which means a set of big data for anybody interested in the study of ancient economies. But this set of big data does not mean that we're not facing also the problem of the scarcity of data on several questions. And I would like first to start with a short feedback based on my personal experience. The particularity of the job of historians of antiquity is that we work on broken and discontinuous sources. More than any other period, antiquity lends itself to the use of models that are supposed to reconstruct broken lines, and it is very useful. Otherwise, you even do not know what you're looking for. So different theories have been proposed to interpret the Delian data with sometimes completely opposite perspectives. I had the advantage of being in the field, and I realized that no one of these models corresponded exactly to what I was able to observe. Moreover, the evidence on Delos were presenting many anomalies in comparison to the usual narrative about ancient economy. For instance, we teach students that in the Attic metrologic system, the obol is divided in 8 calcoi, but in Delos I had evidence that it was divided in 12 at a moment when all the Mediterranean was involved in the system. We teach students that there is clear distinction between sacred and public spheres, but in Delos I had evidence that the sacred and public chests were administrated together. We teach students that warehouses come with the Roman system of the grain distribution, but in Delos I had evidence that storage was earlier part of the distribution channels, and so on. But each time as I discovered something that did not fit the general interpretation of the ancient economy, I was told either that the anomalies were probably mistakes of the stone cutters or so on, or that Delos was an exception that did not resemble the rest of the Greek world. And the implication was that we could do without it, which means that the model is failing and that we have to create another one. So this book is an effort to reintegrate the economic reality on Delos into the interpretative narrative about the ancient economy. A complete set of data is presented in this book, and of course, I will only discuss here some aspects of it. The book is currently translated in English, which hopefully will be available in a year, but for the moment it is fully accessible in French, in print, and also online in open access. So this is the scene. It all began when the great excavations carried out in Greece at the end of the 19th century started to provide massive amounts of archaeological material, as well as inscriptions, including accounts and inventories. In the same time, the large sites excavated in Mesopotamia by the Germans provided financial and accounting documentation of the same nature. Theodor Mommsen predicted that the 20th century would be the era of papyrology, with the discovery of thousands of papyri in British surveys in Egypt. In France and in Germany, historians such as Gustav Glotz, Fritz Heichelheim, and Jacob Larsen worked on this documentation, inscriptions and papyri, as economic historians. The challenge was at the large scale of the Mediterranean to link together quantitative information gathered in different places in order to understand the major movements of something that was conceived as the first stages of the development of capitalism. In this movement of interpretation of the data, the corpus of inscriptions of Delos plays a major role because, besides the papyrological series, because this corpus provides series of prices which, it was thought, could be used for comparisons on the scale of the entire ancient world. Half a century later, with the study of Moses Finley and his followers, we're back to a more political vision of the economic approach and back to a more reduced scale. For Delos, you find the illustration of the political vision of the economic approach in the work of Filippo Coarelli, who insists on the dirigism of the kings on the island, and later in the book of Gary Reger, who applies the principle of Cycladic regionalism to the interpretation of the Delian data. For him, it is the political powers, whether kings or regional bodies, such as the koinon of the Nesiotes, that define the framework of the economic activity. We also change scale, passing from the Mediterranean to the regional Cycladic area, with the idea that what occurs in Delos in terms of economic movement is finally small, reduced, and limited. And it is also the idea of Hervé Duchesne in his synthesis on the port of Delos. The models are strongly opposed, as we can see on this example of Glotz and Rieger's analysis of price setting. On the one side, I quote, the market of Greece becomes universal. It's what Glotz is writing, and it is freely open to import and to competition. On the other side, Gary Rieger, we see local markets, relatively little integration, at most a regional scale, but it is, I quote again, a special case. Both have used series of prices, and both have made statistical analysis, and they demonstrate opposite conclusions. But as you see, there is no real way to measure the exact place of Delos in the Hellenistic Mediterranean in this bibliography, and it remains a special case, which is, in my opinion, not a solution for the understanding of the functioning of the ancient economy. And indeed, during antiquity, the economic situation of Delos was a reason for astonishment. Some myth tried to explain the paradox and to create a narrative for the destiny of Delos, an island without many resources, a growing population, and a prosperity that cannot be explained by the productions of the territory. The reason was that the island had accepted to be the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, despite the anger of the jealous Hera, who was persecuting the poor Leto. So according to the promise of Leto, the island would feed its inhabitants with the arm of others. I quote here the Homeric hymn to Apollo, which is an economic model that the ancient comedy had also translated in its own way by qualifying the Delians of parasites of the god. This is really disconcerting, not only for the ancient Greeks, but moreover for the economic historians, since ancient economic systems are supposed to be based on agricultural subsistence, they're supposed to be led by politics, and they're not supposed to create conditions for economic growth. So how can we understand and describe these notions with historical concepts? What does the model of parasites of the god mean as a model in the economy? The answer requires various studies, including that of the transit trade, in order to analyze the role of Delos as a center of exchange in the Mediterranean. And here we reach a first difficulty. By definition, archaeologically speaking, the transit trade leaves little to no trace in the archaeology. You have goods that arrive and leave, and what you find on the spot is not necessarily representative of the commercial network that characterize a transit trade activity. That's why you need to correlate and to contextualize different types of sources. First of all, the accounts of the sanctuary of Apollo, which is a very complex and teeming corpus of 500 inscriptions on stone from the 5th to the 1st century BC. They were engraved annually, but all the periods are not equally represented. For instance, we have some big steles of 1.5 meter high, but only small fragments for the end of the 3rd century BC, contrary to other periods. It is teeming, but logical. It is a professional accounting, so it was necessary first to find the logic of this documentation. And here I applied the methods of experimental archaeology and redid the work of the administrators with their methods of counting on the abacus. I will quickly summarize the results because they are important. They're important for the issue. These 500 stones create altogether a kind of monument. At least part of them were visible in the passage between the two temples. And all the stones would have made a wall approximately 0.5 kilometer long. But this presence of the stele of accounts and inventories is completely hidden from our perception of the archaeological site. We do not see them on this model, and we do not perceive their importance. Also, they occupied a considerable place in the sanctuary and in the eyes of the visitors at that time. Many scholars have emphasized that the inscribed accounts are the symbolic expression of the probity of the civic magistrates in charge of the administration of the sacred goods. This seems to me very reductive, considering the materiality of this epigraphic corpus. One of the demonstrations of the book is that it is a professional accounting due to the civic community of Delos and its magistrates, the hieropoioi, in charge of the administration of the sanctuary. It relies on the skills acquired by the Delian administrator. From generation to generation, they benefited from their collaboration with the Athenians in the classical period, when the sanctuary was under the authority of Athens, and thus they absorbed some of the Athenians' imperialism administrative methods. Then the sanctuary also benefited from the professionalism that developed among individual Delians with the private business activity of the classical and Hellenistic period. Many of them were professionals of the finance because since they could not develop large agricultural domains in the island, they invested in commercial and financial activities. And some were bankers with accounting know-how. Moreover, according to the institutions of the city of Delos, the council and the assembly had a very important role of financial control in the management of the sacred treasury and of the public treasury too. Delos had few citizens, approximately 1,200 citizens at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. So it created an important rotation of the charge and a very good circulation of the technical competencies. There was an administrative and financial culture in Delos among the citizens because of the presence of the sanctuary and because of the necessity to administrate the goods of the god Apollo. There are also two important points that I want to highlight on that topic. First, the inscriptions provide an annual and detailed accounting for the sacred chest and for the public chest too. It is a real management system based on several accounts books, as you see on this slide, a system which is close to the double entry bookkeeping that was theorized later on the Renaissance, which relies on a network of actors. Second, the financial inscriptions were displayed for all. They were visible and accessible in the sanctuary, and it is an information system promoting open access in a way. The financial inscriptions are really the core of the island's functioning. Another category of sources to investigate is the commercial infrastructure. And here in the framework of a specific program whose results are published in another book, I had the opportunity to investigate with a team of architects and archaeologists the so-called seafront of Delos and to make comparative studies with Roman case studies of storage places and warehouses. And here we made it clear that from the 4th century BC at least, and whatever the political power was, Delos gradually developed an emporium with more of a kilometer of warehouses at the end of the 2nd century BC. They are not houses, they are not workshops, they are warehouses organized according to a regular module of 900 meters square on the ground, as you see here on this reconstruction, a module which is repeated all along the shoreline. They include a line of storage rooms, accessible here from the seafront, from the docks, with secure locking systems. And at the back, around a courtyard, there are several rooms that could also include administrative functions of stock management, as it is shown elsewhere by epigraphic sources from the Roman period that allow us to understand the management methods of these warehouses. The rooms were also equipped with mezzanines, as you see on this picture. Mezzanines whose carrying capacities we have studied, and they systematically double the storage capacity of these spaces. So keep in mind that the surface currently excavated constitutes only a part of this whole. At the beginning of the 1st century BC, the excavated part represents more than 400 meters square of storage. That is to say, the equivalent of the imperial warehouse of Myra or of Patara in Roman Lycia or of Ergla in Roman Tunisia. Also, it is not an organization in large tetragonal modules like we know it in the Roman architecture, but it's a lot of storage capacity. In the Finlayian atmosphere of the minimization of the role of Delos to an only Cycladic context, we had lost sight of this aspect. And it asks again the question of the scales of the exchange, and it calls for a reevaluation of the identity of Delos as a Mediterranean emporium, as you see. The third type of sources are the circulating artifacts. I did not take into account for the moment the ceramics for 2 reasons. First, because in the French school we have several studies underway on this material on Delos, and second, because it says few things about transit trade. But I used the coins, both the coins struck by the city of Delos and the foreign currencies found during all the excavations. Altogether, these represent approximately 6,000 coins and only 220 from the city of Delos itself. The majority of them are small bronzes, ugly but interesting material. But as you will see, the inscriptions give much more detail on coinage, especially silver coinage and money circulation. The inscriptions show how the administrators were able to create, through money lending and investments, a permanent recycling of cash that went in and out the island, using not only the civic coinage, which had a very small place in the system, but mainly the other currencies. And on this point, Delos is an observatory of the monetary circulation and a mirror for the transformation of the monetary landscape in the Aegean. So we now have pretty much set the scene. High level of specialization of the citizens and financial accounting, big commercial infrastructures, money circulation on the Aegean scale. But what kind of scene is it? For sure, it is not the setting of a teeny island economy based on autarkeia and lack. Neither the setting of a regional system, because what we observe largely exceeds the limit of the Cycladic regionalism. So let's see now how it works. Pausanias qualifies Delos as a koinon Hellenon emporion, but it was already the case in the 4th century BC. A fragmentary speech of Hyperides related to the dispute which opposed Athens and Delos for the administration of the sanctuary describes Delos like an emporium, contrary to the neighboring island, Rhenia, which does not have any. Emporion means a special structure. It describes a port of storage where goods are collected in order to be redistributed to other destinations. And in the administrative accounts of the classical period, when the sanctuary is administered by Athenian magistrates, taxes are recorded. They had been created by Athens at the end of the 5th century to increase the sanctuary's assets. Among the port taxes, we find parking fees, like Leman or Elimanion, fees for the use of loading and unloading facilities, Stropheia, Iresia, Anaphoron, and also tolls, Olkos, Portmeon. As you see, all this draws a harbor landscape, which is indeed, and since the classical period, that of an emporium, based on the economic and banking activity of the sanctuary at a scale which is already larger than the Cyclades. And the situation developed more and more even after the disappearance of the Athenian power, that is, after the conquest of Alexander the Great and the liberation of the island in 314 BC. Several patterns in the inscriptions indicate a growth of population since the very beginning of the 3rd century BC. We can see it again in the accounts of the sanctuary through some taxes whose contributions have considerably increased in the chest of the sanctuary. The decate on rented houses and the decate on fish. These two indices reveal the presence of an additional population with activities based on the rental of craft or commercial buildings. And from these figures, we can develop some estimates, as you see here on the slide. It reveals a population of at least 8,000 adult people during the first half of the 3rd century BC. So we know with certainty, thanks to the accounts, that at the beginning of the 2nd century BC, Delos counted 1,200 male citizens, even adding the families. And despite the scarcity of data, you see that with 8,000 adults at the beginning of the 3rd century, there is already a place for a good part of foreigners involved in the activities of the emporium. And I add 2 more observations concerning this period. First, bankers were working with the administrators on the finances of the god, which means that bankers were also available for other private business activities. And contrary to other places in Greece, on Delos, the city left to the bankers the profit coming from money changing. They only had to pay the fees for the place. And second, in the honorary decrees, the city of Delos gives a great importance to the privilege of ateleia, the exemption of taxes, that was often granted to foreigners. Of the 500 or so decrees for benefactors that are preserved, at least 1 in 5 has an ateleia clause preserved, whereas this privilege is much more rarely distributed in other cities. Other documents show that the ateleis, those who were granted the exemption of taxes, constituted a legal, separated, and well-identified category of population. So, important population of foreigners, broad concession of the ateleia, absence of taxes for money changers. Let us anticipate a little on the conclusions. We see that as of 3rd century BC, Delos was functioning almost like a free port of trade. And that is before the date of 167 BC, when Rome decided to keep Delos as a free port under Athenian rule. And indeed, what Rome created in 167 BC, when it decided to keep Delos as a free port under Athenian rule, was exactly an ateleia, as explained by Pollux in the Onomasticon. As you see here on the screen, the definition of ateleia in the onomasticon of Pollux is that which is not subject to a tax is called exempt, and the action is called exemption. It is not only a person who is exempt, but also a port where nothing is taken. And it is exactly the situation of Delos, the ateleia, after 167 BC. And after the wars of Mithridates, again in 58 BC, the law Gabinia Calpurnia reaffirms the continuities on this topic. Let the island in which it is believed that Apollo and Diana were born be free of taxes, an island that has always been independent of the authority of all kings, cities, and peoples, divine property, and free of taxes. So in 167 BC, the city of the Delians disappears, but from the economic point of view, continuities prevail over rupture. By this decision, when calling Delos a free port of trade, Rome did not create it ex nihilo, but Rome relied on an existing situation that it only had to amplify. And this is maybe one of the most obvious examples of economic growth in the Greek world. This growth is also reflected in commercial infrastructure, and at least from the 5th century BC, the harbor front is constantly under reconstruction to adapt to new development. There are spaces of sale for the transit trade, and the law on the sale of wood and charcoal that you see here testifies to this, mentioning the appropriate places for the scale of these goods, xuleros statmos. This method of sale was generally the auction, which allowed the sale of cargoes by unloading samples. This place where the inscription was found was then destroyed at the end of the 3rd century BC by the construction of porticos, in whose foundation the stele bearing the inscription was discovered. The agora of the Delians is gradually framed with porticos, and after this redesign, the sale places move toward the agora of Theophrastos in the north, while the places for storage are assigned to the south. We can guess the ancient shoreline with constructions now underwater. On this agora in the north, we have found circles, kykloi, which are used for the auction. Okay. So on this agora here in the north, we have found kykloi, circles, which are used for the auctions. And in the northwestern part here of the same space, we have also at the end of the 3rd century, the construction of a big hall whose construction is well known thanks to the building accounts, and it has more than 1,800 meters square and was used for commercial purpose. So commercial banking offices, places of business, negotiation and conclusion of contracts could have taken place here. And you see the size of the building is impressive because it is bigger than the temples, as you see it in comparison here, which testifies to Delos' willingness to invest in its commercial infrastructure at that time, at the end of the 3rd century BC. So such an activity seems very little adapted to only the Cycladic regionalism, whereas it sounds well with the role of a great emporium since the classical time, well before the creation of the free port and with the continuity of its development. The development of the Delian emporium and its role of redistributions needed infrastructures for commercial negotiation and sale, but it could also not be achieved without the emergence of storage structures and practices of storage. This development of storage made it possible to relay the effects of fluctuations linked to imports and to ensure over the year a stabilization of costs, which is precisely what the price curves from the middle of the 3rd century show. I have no time for this demonstration, but we will find it. You will find it in the book. The storage of foodstuffs certainly made it possible to reduce the effects of breaks linked to the production conditions or to the breaks in more distant distribution circuits, because storage produces a year-round smoothing effect on prices and on transport costs. The methods, these year-round smoothing effect on prices and on transport costs, is a method well known, and Lysias, for instance, in his speech against the corn dealers, says no different. Also, the period considered here is maybe shorter. If you remember this aspect of Lysias' speech, when he says, if they acted in your interest by buying wheat massively, we should have seen the price maintained for many days until their stocks were exhausted. So it is a well-known method since the classical period. The Atelier made it more interesting than elsewhere to centralize in Delos goods in great quantity. As an economic and financial center, with traders and bankers gathering a varied population, Delos reduced at the same time the costs of economic transaction by facilitating the meeting of the actors of the exchange, and it improves the circulation of the economic information. To this term of emporion, which qualifies Delos since the 4th century BC, is aided in the 2nd century BC another term, ekdokeion, which means tanks. So how do we know that? In 167 BC, some properties were confiscated from the expelled Delians. And we have lists of properties that were leased at that time, among which ekdokeia, that is warehouses, are mentioned. Warehouses that were the property of private Delians already before the coming of Athens. So the ekdokeion or hypodokeion refers to a specific function of storage in supply circuits. The term uses the notion of reservoir, of tank, etymologically with the idea of receiving from someone, which is the meaning of ekdekome. Strabo uses, as you see on the screen, Strabo uses it about Ephesus and Apamea of Phrygia to emphasize the connections within a distribution network between a reservoir and its supply and redistribution conduits. And the word is used also to design the warehouses on Delos already at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. Indication on Delos show that this reality was well known. They come from warehousemen, ship owners and importers from Phoenicia, Laodicea of Phoenicia, that was later called Berytus, and from Alexandria. And again, the notion of ekdokeion designating the activity of transit trade in Delos exists before and after the creation of the free port. So we have seen this, the scene and the chronology of the continuous development of the activity of transit trade. Let's look now at the scale of this activity. If Delos is a center of redistribution, it is logical that we should be able to observe there the great meteorological changes which affect all the maritime area. And yes, indeed, the Delian monetary policy shows its porosity to the great Mediterranean evolutions. For instance, it is quite characteristic that on Delos, the inventories of precious offerings reveals that the gold collection increases significantly between the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd century BC. But after, gold becomes a much less important commodity in the collection of precious offerings, and this is obviously the effect of the dethesaurization of Persian treasures after Alexander's conquest. the effects of which we see in the sanctuary of Apollo in Delos. Moreover, the monetary policy of the city of Delos during the third and the first half of the second centuries BC is anything but the sign of a regional insertion. The accounts of the Hieropoio reveal meteorological changes and on an Aegean scale, which show that the Delian data constitute a perfect observatory of the economic policies in the Mediterranean. Sorry for the technical character of the following demonstration, which is going to be some kind of witch's kitchen, but I think it is important to enter in this detail. From the years 280 BC, we notice in the accounts that a meteorological reform makes Delos change from a base 8 to a base 12. And it is not a local decision because it is about transactions carried out with foreign importers. Consequently, it is a sign that the city of Delos chooses to adapt to a more general change that occurred in the Eastern Mediterranean, that is a non-Attic model, which is imposing itself in the Aegean trade. How do we know that? From this year's 280s, the obol comprises 12 calcoi and not 8. Also, the system of bookkeeping is always following the Attic standard, as the Hieropoio precise it in their account, Eis Alexandreion Logon. For instance, if you read 2 obols, half an obol, and 5 calcoi, it means that you do not have an obol with 8 calcoi. Otherwise, we would have 3 obols and 1 calcoi in the subdivision systems of this accounting. And moreover, in the measures of capacity, the metrology of the amphora as a measure of capacity is changing in the same way. It takes the form of a devaluation which happens around 280 BC. So let us see this example that you have here with the purchases of pitch by the sanctuary during the year 282 BC, where we see precisely this change of system appear. The first purchase is for 3 metritae and 2 kois, and it is paid 78 drachmas. We deduce that the metretes as a measure of capacity comprise 8 kois, which make at the rate of 3 drachmas a unit, 78 drachmas for 26 kois. But here on the second line, the second purchase later in the same year is of 3 metretes and a kous, paid 74 drachmas. And here the metretes is divided into 12 kois, which make at the rate of 2 drachmas the unit, 74 drachmas for 37 kois. And that year, the Hieropoio recorded, as you see, 2 different meteorological systems. The first with the metretes divided in 8, and the second with the metretes divided in 12. And it is the last one that is then used in the next accounts. So these changes affected daily trade, and they did not originate from a local initiative, even if we perceive them only through the accounting problems of the administrators of the sanctuary, who had to give correct accounts with correct mathematical operations. And they are reflecting transformations which take place in the Aegean commercial circuits, in which Delos is a center of exchanges. So they show that new authorities are coming to the fore. Moreover, and it is another important example of this, during the same 280s, the city of Delos issues a new currency for the first time since the official departure of the Athenians that occurred in 314 BC. And we have very few examples. of this coinage, meaning that the artifacts do not help understand the standard, but the evidence of the epigraphic accounts do help. And again, sorry, I do not have the time to enter here in details into my demonstration, which is in the book, but I start from the fact that I believe that I have understood that the Hieropoioi in their bookkeeping count sometimes batches of coins of the city of Delos and indicate in this case both their local value and the equivalence according to the Attic standard. And it allows us to observe the evolutions of the weight of the Delian drachma during 1 century about. We thus obtain a Delian drachma whose theoretical weight is at the time of the first monetary emission, that is around 280 BC. The weight is of 3.47 grams, that is to say much less than the Attic standard of 4.33 grams. It is characteristic that the coinage of Delos does not copy the choices made by other islands of the Cyclades, and it invites us again to call into question the idea of a Cycladic regionalism. Delian coinage is a coinage without economic purpose. It only serves to provide small denomination for the payment of taxes and small expenses inside the island. It is therefore a continuation and a reflection of other external currencies that were used for larger payments. So when the Delians decided to mint coins of reduced weight in comparison with the Attic standard, around 280 BC, what references did they have in mind? Probably the same references as when they ratified at the same time the metrological devaluation of the metrics that we have seen right now. And it is very probable that the Delian coinage marks a break with the Attic standard and refers to the Rhodian and Ptolemaic networks in the Aegean, because in 280, the Delians could legitimately think that the coinage of these two powers, the Ptolemies and the Rhodian, were imposing themselves durably in the Aegean trade, and they made the choice to insert their own currency into this system. But it was a bad forecast, a very bad forecast, because the Ptolemies disappeared during the second half of the 3rd century BC, and then the Delians followed the monetary emissions of Rhodes and Histiaia, which invaded the markets in the years 230 BC, because there were monetary issues struck for the payment of mercenaries in the Aegean, and the metrology of the Delian drachma gradually dropped below 3 grams, as you see it on the slide. Later, the Delians even created a new coinage about 173 BC, the phoinicophoroi, following the new plintophoroi of the Rhodians. But again, it was too late, and it was a bad forecast because Rome, a few years later, gives up Rhodes and chooses Athens to administer the island of Delos. So the Delians, as you see, with their neutrality, always tried to adapt, and they were trying to situate themselves in a shifting monetary landscape, certainly difficult to decipher and unfit for anticipation. And in a way, they failed, but they probably had no other way to manage this situation. This fragility is visible a posteriori in the inventories of coins made by the Athenians when they came back after 167 BC. The Athenians found a lot of cash classified in many jugs by the Hieropoioi. It was the chest of the sanctuary with about 140,000 of drachmas according to the Attic standard, that is about 23 talents. And the Athenians carried out an audit and counted the coins found in the cache of the sanctuary according to their type and standard. And here in the accounts, we have the description of the composition of the real cache, where the Europoi handed the same currencies, but held the accounts with equivalence to the Attic standard, without mentioning the origin of accounts. So the inventory, the audit and the inventory of the Athenians is very useful for us to understand the real cash that was handled by the Europoi, by the administrators at the time before 167. Thanks to this double information, we can understand that the cash of the sanctuary in the first half of the 2nd century had very few coins from Attic standard, or if you prefer, very few coins from Alexander standard. We guess that about 2 talents only were on the chest, contrary to the beginning of the 3rd century. And the cash on hand was made with different types of coins and standards, and most of them were monetary issues circulating for the payment of mercenaries in the Aegean, because we see that we had coinage from Rhodian, Euboean, and Histiaean provenance. So this diversity was in fact very useful for the different payments that the Europoi had to make, and it allowed them to have an appropriate economic strategy using different currencies. But this situation reveals the limits of the Delian prosperity, because with the treasure of Apollo, the city of Delos had, since the 5th century BC, a collection of Attic coins that had become obsolete by the 2nd century BC. So a large part of the treasure was useless, and it is the third of the collection. So Delos could not solve this problem by monetary emissions, because it had no interest to strike currency in abundance. Because of its neutrality, it did not have the needed authority to impose the circulation of a new coinage, as Athens would later do with its new coinage, Stephanophoros. But the Emporion of Delos, with its bankers and traders combined with the chest of the sanctuary, was a very efficient instrument for recycling and monetary mixing through the economic activity, as it is shown here on this slide. So it is probably this model that describes the activity of an Emporion, Ekdokeion, as we have seen it in different sources. And it was still true after 167 BC, because it is quite probable that the public bank of Delos was then used to collect the foreign coinages, so that they were transformed into monetary emissions of Stephanophori. So as you see, the recipe is the same, and again we find this process of continuity. So I believe, therefore, that that is possible to write today another economic history of Delos based on the observation of continuities and on the analysis of the structures. This economic system existed in the Eastern Mediterranean during at least 5 centuries, and it consisted in an efficient accounting and financial know-how, a prosperity based on a central public actor, the sanctuary and its heritage, port structures suitable for large-scale transit trade, despite the small amount of space available, and a connection to the Mediterranean financial and economic issues. In this landscape, the Delians, parasites of the god, as well as their predecessors and successors, the Athenians, clearly demonstrated great inventiveness in terms of financial techniques and administrative policy in a permanently evolving Hellenistic world. And they sometimes made mistakes of appreciation or did not have enough authority to impose more favorable choices. But what existed in the Eastern Mediterranean, and which is visible through Delos, it is not a history of autarkeia, of local small world. It is a business model at the city scale. And I think that Hellenistic Delos represent this moment of emergence of a financial and commercial system which articulates the public resources with the initiative of the privates. And this system was able to function as long as it remained outside the mechanism of Roman imperialism. And in a way, this continuity started with the coming of Roman imperialism in this system. Thank you for your attention.